I spent 32 years believing I was the family disappointment, until one piece of paper changed everything. Hi, I'm Danielle, and I grew up in a house where my mother's approval felt like something I could never quite reach. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel small, even when I was doing my best. My younger sister was always the responsible one in her eyes. I was the scattered dreamer who couldn't be trusted with anything important. That label followed me into adulthood, shaping how I saw myself. Last Thanksgiving, I drove 3 hours to my parents' house in Ohio with a knot in my stomach. I was bringing news I thought would finally make my mother proud. I had just been promoted to regional manager at my company after 7 years of hard work. I practiced what I would say the entire drive, imagining her smile, hoping this time would be different. But the moment I walked through the door, I could feel the familiar tension settle over me. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, stirring something on the stove without looking up. She asked if I had remembered to bring the cranberry sauce she requested. I had forgotten. It was a small thing, but her sigh filled the entire room. She muttered something about how I could never be counted on for even the simplest tasks. My father was in the living room watching football, and he waved at me warmly, but I barely registered it. I decided to wait until dinner to share my news. I helped set the table, folded the napkins the way my mother liked, and tried to make myself useful. But everything I did seemed to invite criticism. The glasses were in the wrong spots. The silverware was crooked. My mother corrected each mistake with a patience that somehow felt more cutting than anger. I started to wonder if telling her about my promotion was even worth it anymore. During dinner, I finally found my courage. I cleared my throat and announced that I had been promoted. I explained what the new role meant, how much more responsibility I would have, how proud I was of myself. My father immediately congratulated me, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. But my mother just nodded and said it was nice, then changed the subject to my sister's new house renovation. The dismissal stung more than I expected it to. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub, trying to calm down. I told myself it didn't matter what she thought. I was successful. I had built a good life. But the little girl inside me still wanted her mother to see her, really see her. I splashed water on my face and decided I would leave early the next morning. There was no point in staying where I wasn't celebrated. When I came back downstairs, I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. My mother's voice was sharp, and my father's was unusually firm. I paused in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to walk away. I heard my mother say something about how I would just mess it up like I always did. My chest tightened. I didn't know what she was referring to, but the words cut deep. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. I was about to retreat upstairs when my father walked out of the kitchen holding a piece of paper. His face was serious, and he looked at me with something I couldn't quite read. He asked me to sit down in the living room. My mother followed behind him, her expression tight and unreadable. I sat on the old floral couch where I had spent so many childhood afternoons, suddenly feeling like a teenager again, waiting to be scolded. My father handed me the paper without saying a word. It was a letter addressed to me, already opened. The return address was from my late grandmother's estate attorney. I looked up at my parents, confused. My grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, and I thought all the estate matters had been settled. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and my father just nodded for me to read it. The letter explained that my grandmother had left a separate trust specifically for me. It wasn't part of the main estate that had been divided between my mother and her siblings. This was something private, something my grandmother had arranged years before her death. The trust contained enough money to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a house. I read the words 3 times, unable to believe them. I looked at my mother and asked why I was only seeing this now. The letter was dated 8 months ago. She finally met my eyes and said she didn't think I was ready for that kind of responsibility. She said I would have wasted it on something foolish, that she was protecting me from myself. Her voice was steady, like she genuinely believed she had done the right thing. I felt something shift inside me, a wall going up. My father spoke before I could respond. He said he had just found the letter that morning, tucked in my mother's desk drawer. He hadn't known she was hiding it. His voice was heavy with disappointment, but it wasn't directed at me. For the first time I could remember, he was openly disagreeing with my mother in front of me. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. I asked my mother what made her think she had the right to keep this from me. She started to explain again about responsibility and my history of poor decisions, but I stopped her. I told her I had been paying my own bills since I was 22. I had worked my way up from an entry-level position to regional manager without any help. I asked her what irresponsible thing I had actually done that justified hiding my own inheritance from me. She couldn't answer. For once, my mother had no criticism ready, no correction to offer. She just sat there, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. I realized in that moment that her view of me had never been about who I actually was. It was about who she needed me to be so she could feel like the better mother, the one who had raised one perfect daughter and one who still needed saving. My father apologized to me quietly. He said he should have paid closer attention, should have asked more questions when the estate was settled. I told him it wasn't his fault. He had always believed in me, even when he didn't say it out loud. His support had been quiet, but consistent, and I hadn't fully appreciated it until that moment. I reached over and held his hand for a long minute. I told my mother I wasn't angry, and I meant it. Anger felt like too small a word for what I was feeling. I was sad for all the years I had spent chasing approval that was never going to come. I was sad for her too, trapped in a version of me that existed only in her mind. But I was also relieved. This moment had set something free inside me that I didn't know was caged. I left the next morning as planned, but the drive home felt different. The knot in my stomach was gone, replaced by something lighter. I thought about my grandmother, who had seen me clearly enough to plan for my future. She had believed I could handle responsibility. She had trusted me with something meaningful. That knowledge felt like a gift beyond the money itself. A few weeks later, I used part of the trust to pay off my student loans, just as my grandmother had intended. I called my father to tell him, and I could hear the pride in his voice. He said my grandmother would have been so happy. I believed him. For the first time, I let myself feel worthy of something good happening to me without waiting for someone to take it away. My mother and I still talk, but things are different now. I no longer twist myself into knots trying to earn her approval. I call when I want to, not out of obligation or hope. She has never apologized for hiding the letter, and I've accepted that she probably never will. Some people cannot admit when they're wrong, and I've stopped needing her to. My peace doesn't depend on her anymore. Looking back, I think that Thanksgiving was the day I finally grew up, not because of the money, but because I stopped seeing myself through my mother's eyes. I am not the irresponsible daughter she created in her mind. I am a woman who works hard, shows up, and deserves to be trusted. That paper didn't just give me financial freedom. It gave me permission to believe in myself without apology. 3 months after Thanksgiving, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner in my small apartment, finally enjoying the quiet I had built for myself. The caller ID showed my sister's name, and I hesitated before answering. Claire and I had never been close, not really. She was 5 years younger and had always occupied a different space in our family, one that came with easier expectations and softer landings. Claire's voice was tight when I picked up. She said she needed to talk about Mom. I leaned against my kitchen counter and waited, stirring the pasta slowly. She explained that our mother had been acting strangely since Thanksgiving, withdrawing from family dinners and spending long hours alone in her room. Claire sounded worried, but there was also an edge of accusation in her tone. She asked what had happened between us that weekend. I told her the truth. I explained about the letter, the hidden trust, and the confrontation that followed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Claire breathing, processing what I had shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I expected. She said she had no idea any of that had happened. Mom had told her I left early because I was being dramatic about something minor. That didn't surprise me. Our mother had always been skilled at shaping narratives to protect herself, but hearing Claire repeat it still stung. I asked my sister if she believed me, and she said she did. but I could hear the hesitation underneath her words. Claire had spent her whole life being the favored child. Accepting that our mother could be deliberately hurtful meant rethinking everything she thought she knew about our family. Claire asked if I would consider coming home to talk things through. She said Dad had been quiet lately, caught between wanting peace and knowing something was broken. I told her I wasn't ready to sit across from Mom and pretend everything was fine. I had spent too many years doing exactly that. Claire sighed and said she understood, but I could tell she wished I would just smooth things over the way I always had. After we hung up, I sat with my cold pasta and thought about my sister. We had grown up in the same house but lived in completely different families. Claire had been praised for her grades, her manners, her steady boyfriend who became her steady husband. I had been questioned, corrected, and found lacking at every turn. It wasn't Claire's fault, but it had built a wall between us that neither of us knew how to climb. A week later, Claire texted me a photo. It was an old picture of the two of us at our grandmother's house, standing in her garden with dirt on our hands. I remembered that day vaguely. Grandma had let us plant tomatoes, and we had laughed the entire afternoon. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to remember when Claire and I had stopped laughing together. The distance between us suddenly felt heavier than before. I called Claire that night and asked why she sent the picture. She said she had been going through old albums at Mom's house and found it tucked inside a book. She thought I might want to see it. Her voice was softer now, less guarded. I thanked her and asked if she remembered that day. She said she did, and that Grandma had made us lemonade afterward. I had forgotten that detail. We talked for almost an hour, longer than we had spoken in years. Claire admitted she had always felt guilty about how differently our mother treated us. She said she used to think if she was good enough, maybe Mom would be kinder to me too. But it never worked that way. Hearing her say that out loud cracked something open inside me. I had never known she carried that weight. I asked Claire what she wanted from me now. She said she just wanted us to be sisters again, real sisters who actually knew each other. I told her I wanted that too, but I didn't know how to get there. We had so many years of distance to cross, so many unspoken hurts. She suggested we start small, maybe a phone call every week. I agreed, even though part of me was afraid it wouldn't last. 2 weeks later, Claire drove 3 hours to visit me. She had never seen my apartment before, and I found myself nervous as I tidied up. When she arrived, she looked around with genuine curiosity, complimenting the plants on my windowsill and the books stacked on my coffee table. It felt strange to have her in my space, but also strangely right. We ordered pizza and talked until midnight. She asked about my job, and I told her about my promotion and what it meant to me. Claire listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she was proud of me. Those words hit differently coming from her. It wasn't the approval I had chased from our mother. It was something warmer, something that felt like it came from a place of genuine care rather than judgment. I asked Claire how she was really doing. She hesitated, then admitted her marriage was struggling. Her husband worked long hours, and she often felt alone even when he was home. She said she had been afraid to tell anyone because she didn't want to lose her image as the sister who had everything figured out. I reached over and squeezed her hand. I told her having struggles didn't make her a failure. We stayed up late talking about things we had never shared before. Claire told me she had always envied my independence, my willingness to forge my own path even when it meant disappointing people. I told her I had envied her certainty, her ability to fit so seamlessly into what was expected. We realized we had each been longing for something the other had, never knowing we were mirrors of each other's hidden fears. Before she left the next morning, Claire hugged me longer than she ever had. She said she was sorry for all the years she hadn't stood up for me, all the times she stayed silent when Mom criticized me. I told her she was just a kid trying to survive the same house I was. We couldn't have saved each other then, but maybe we could now. She nodded, her eyes wet. After Claire drove away, I sat in my quiet apartment and cried. They weren't sad tears exactly. They were release tears, the kind that come when something you didn't know you were holding finally lets go. My sister and I had wasted so many years being strangers. But we were choosing differently now. That choice felt like the beginning of something I hadn't dared to hope for. A few days later, my father called. He said Claire had told him about her visit, and he was glad we were reconnecting. His voice was warm but tired. He admitted he had spent too many years keeping the peace instead of speaking up. He said watching his daughters find their way back to each other made him realize he needed to do better too. I told him it wasn't too late. He asked if I would ever be willing to talk to my mother again. I said I didn't know. The hurt was still too fresh, and I wasn't sure she was capable of hearing me even if I tried. He didn't push. He just said he loved me and that he would always be in my corner. Those words meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. I held on to them like something precious. Spring came slowly that year, and with it, a sense of renewal I hadn't expected. Claire and I kept our promise, calling each week and texting in between. We were learning each other as adults, discovering who we were outside our mother's shadow. It wasn't perfect, and sometimes old patterns crept in, but we kept choosing to try. That consistency was healing something that had been broken for decades. I still don't know what will happen with my mother. Some days I think about reaching out, and other days I feel certain I'm not ready. But I've stopped letting that uncertainty define me. I have my father's quiet love, my sister's growing friendship, and my grandmother's belief in who I could become. For now, that is enough. For now, I am building a family on my own terms, and it feels like coming home. Summer arrived with unexpected warmth, and with it came an invitation I wasn't prepared for. My father called to tell me he was turning 70 in August, and he wanted both his daughters there to celebrate. His voice carried a hope I couldn't ignore. He said it would mean the world to him if I came, even just for the afternoon. I told him I would think about it, but we both knew I had already decided. The weeks leading up to the party were filled with quiet anxiety. Claire called more often, checking in on how I was feeling about seeing our mother again. I appreciated her concern, but I didn't have clear answers. Part of me wanted to prove I could walk into that house with my head held high. Another part wanted to cancel and send a gift instead. The push and pull exhausted me more than I expected. I drove to Ohio on a Friday afternoon, giving myself a full day before the party to settle my nerves. Claire had offered to let me stay at her house instead of our parents' place, and I accepted gratefully. Her guest room was small but comfortable, decorated with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Being in her space felt like neutral ground, a place where I could breathe without the weight of old memories pressing down. That evening, Claire and I sat on her back porch with glasses of wine. The summer air was thick and warm, filled with the sound of crickets and distant lawnmowers. She asked if I had thought about what I would say to Mom. I admitted I had rehearsed a dozen different speeches in my head, but none of them felt right. Claire nodded and said maybe I didn't need a speech at all. She told me something that surprised me. In the month since her visit to my apartment, Claire had started seeing a therapist. She said she needed help untangling the guilt she carried about our childhood. I asked what kind of guilt, and she explained she had always felt responsible for being the good daughter, like her perfection was somehow a betrayal of me. I hadn't realized she carried that burden so heavily. I told Claire she didn't owe me an apology for being loved. That wasn't her fault. She was a child responding to the environment our mother created. We both were. Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she said the therapist had told her something similar, but hearing it from me meant more. We sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fireflies blink across her backyard like tiny signals of hope. The morning of my father's birthday, I woke early and went for a walk through Claire's neighborhood. The streets were quiet, lined with houses that looked like the ones I remembered from my childhood. I passed a woman watering her garden and a man walking his dog. Ordinary life happening all around me while I prepared for something that felt enormous. I tried to remind myself that today was about my father, not my unresolved pain. We arrived at my parents' house around noon. The backyard had been decorated with balloons and streamers, and a long table was set up with food my mother had clearly spent days preparing. I noticed the effort she had put in, the attention to details my father would appreciate. Whatever her faults, she loved him. That had never been in question. I wondered if she had any love left for me. My father greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual. He whispered that he was grateful I came, and I felt the sincerity in his voice. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner and his movements slower. 70 years was a long time to navigate a family as complicated as ours. I told him I wouldn't have missed it for anything, and I meant every word. My mother was in the kitchen when I found her, arranging fruit on a platter with the precision of someone who needed everything to be perfect. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said it was good to see me, her voice careful and measured. I said the same, matching her tone. We were two people testing the surface of a frozen lake, unsure if it would hold. The party itself was small, just a handful of neighbors and a few of my father's old colleagues. I stayed close to Claire most of the afternoon, grateful for her presence beside me. We laughed at Dad's terrible jokes and helped serve cake when the time came. For a few hours, I almost forgot the tension simmering beneath the surface. Almost, but not quite. My mother's eyes followed me whenever I moved. Late in the afternoon, I found myself alone at the edge of the yard, looking at my mother's rose bushes. They were beautiful, well-tended and vibrant with color. I remembered helping her plant them when I was 12. How proud I had been when she praised my careful digging. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else, a version of our relationship that had been buried under years of criticism. I wondered if she ever thought about those softer days. She appeared beside me without warning, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She offered one to me, and I took it, surprised by the gesture. We stood side by side in silence, both of us staring at the roses. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. She said she knew she hadn't been the mother I needed. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and unexpected. I didn't respond right away. I needed a moment to process what I had just heard. She continued, saying she had spent a lot of time thinking since Thanksgiving. She admitted she had been afraid of something she couldn't name, and that fear had made her hold too tightly to control. She said it wasn't an excuse, just the truth. I felt my throat tighten with emotions I wasn't ready to release. I asked her why she had hidden the letter from Grandma. Her face tightened, and I thought she might retreat into defensiveness. But instead, she said she had been jealous. She admitted that her own mother had never seen her the way she saw me. That confession stunned me into silence. I had never considered that my mother's cruelty might have roots in her own unhealed wounds. She said my grandmother had always favored my independence, my willingness to be different. It reminded her of everything she had been too afraid to become herself. She had punished me for the freedom she never allowed herself to have. Hearing this didn't erase the pain she had caused, but it did help me understand her in a way I never had before. She was flawed, deeply and painfully flawed. I told her that understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. She nodded and said she knew. She wasn't asking me to forgive her today or maybe ever. She just wanted me to know that she saw what she had done, and she was sorry. The apology was imperfect, incomplete in ways that mattered, but it was also more than I had ever expected to receive from her. We walked back to the party together, not touching but closer than we had been in years. My father caught my eye across the yard and smiled, sensing that something had shifted. Claire appeared at my side and quietly asked if I was okay. I told her I was, and for once it wasn't a lie. The wound hadn't healed, but the bleeding had finally stopped. That felt like progress. That night, I stayed at my parents' house for the first time since Thanksgiving. My old bedroom looked exactly as I remembered it, frozen in a time before everything fell apart. I lay in my childhood bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the woman my mother had revealed herself to be. She was more complicated than I had allowed her to be in my anger. We both were. In the morning, I hugged my father goodbye and promised to visit more often. When I turned to my mother, she reached out and touched my arm gently. She didn't say anything, but her eyes held a softness I hadn't seen in decades. I nodded once and walked to my car. The drive home felt different this time, not because everything was fixed, but because I finally believed it could be. And believing felt like the first real step. Autumn came quickly that year. painting the trees outside my apartment window in shades of gold and rust. I had settled into a new rhythm since my father's birthday, one that included regular phone calls with Claire and occasional texts from my mother. The texts were simple things, a photo of her garden or a recipe she thought I might like. Small gestures that asked for nothing in return. I found myself saving each one without knowing exactly why. Work had become busier with my new role, and I welcomed the distraction. Managing a region meant long days and difficult decisions, but I was good at it. My confidence had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated. I no longer second-guessed every choice or waited for someone to tell me I was doing it wrong. The voice in my head that once sounded like my mother had grown quieter, replaced by something that sounded more like my own. One evening in late October, Claire called with news that caught me off guard. She told me she and her husband were separating. Her voice was steady but tired, carrying the weight of a decision that had been a long time coming. She said they had tried counseling, but some distances couldn't be closed. I listened without interrupting, remembering how she had once seemed to have the perfect life I could never achieve. I asked her how she was really feeling, beneath the composed exterior she had perfected over the years. She was quiet for a moment, then admitted she felt relieved and terrified in equal measure. She said she had spent so long being what everyone expected that she didn't know who she was on her own. I told her I understood that feeling more than she knew. We were both learning to exist outside the roles our family had assigned us. Claire asked if she could come stay with me for a few days while she figured things out. The request surprised me, but I said yes immediately. A year ago, I would have hesitated, unsure if we were close enough for that kind of intimacy. But something had changed between us. We had become the sisters we should have been all along, connected by choice rather than just blood. She arrived on a Friday evening with 2 suitcases and red-rimmed eyes. I didn't ask questions. I just helped her carry her bags inside and ordered Thai food from the place down the street. We ate cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by takeout containers and comfortable silence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply be present, without demanding explanations or offering solutions. The next morning, Claire woke early and made coffee while I was still half asleep. I found her standing at my kitchen window, watching the neighborhood come to life below. She said she had forgotten what it felt like to have a morning that belonged only to her. Her husband had always been an early riser with specific routines. She had shaped herself around his schedule for so long that her own preferences had faded. We spent the weekend doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary in their simplicity. We walked through the farmer's market, browsed a used bookstore, and cooked dinner together with too much garlic and laughter. Claire seemed lighter with each passing hour, shedding invisible weight she had carried for years. I recognized the transformation because I had experienced my own version of it. Freedom, even painful freedom, has a way of making you breathe deeper. On Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from our mother. She asked how we were doing, including both of us in the question for the first time I could remember. Claire saw the message over my shoulder and raised her eyebrows. She said it was strange to see Mom reaching out like that, without expectation or criticism. I agreed, but admitted I wasn't entirely sure how to respond. Claire suggested we call her together. The idea made me nervous, but I agreed. We sat side by side on my couch as the phone rang, our shoulders touching for silent support. When Mom answered, her voice was cautious, as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We talked for 20 minutes about small, safe topics. It wasn't a breakthrough conversation, but it also wasn't painful. That alone felt like significant progress. After we hung up, Claire said she was proud of me for trying. I told her the same. We had spent so many years navigating our mother separately, building our own defenses and coping mechanisms. Facing her together felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from us. We were rewriting the rules of our family, one small conversation at a time. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I was no longer afraid to find out. The following week, Claire found a small apartment a few miles from mine. She said she needed her own space to figure out who she was becoming. I helped her move in on a Saturday, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and arguing playfully about where to put her furniture. Her new place was tiny but full of light. She stood in the empty living room and smiled like someone seeing possibility for the first time. November brought an unexpected invitation. My mother called to ask if Claire and I would come home for Thanksgiving, just the four of us this year. No extended family, no performances for anyone else. She said she wanted to try again, to have a holiday that felt real instead of staged. I told her I needed to think about it. The memory of last Thanksgiving still lingered, sharp around the edges. I talked it over with Claire that evening. She was hesitant too, but also curious. She said maybe this was our chance to see if things could actually be different. We decided to go together, promising each other that we would leave if it became too much. Having an exit strategy made the decision feel less frightening. We were no longer the daughters who had to endure whatever our mother decided to give us. The drive to Ohio felt familiar, but different. Claire sat beside me in the passenger seat, and we talked the entire way about memories we had never compared before. She told me about moments from our childhood that I had interpreted completely differently. We realized how much our mother's favoritism had distorted our understanding of each other and ourselves. The distance between us had been built on misperception, not genuine difference. When we arrived, our father met us in the driveway, his face bright with happiness. He hugged us both at the same time, his arms barely long enough to hold us together. He said having his girls home meant everything to him. I noticed he looked healthier than he had at his birthday, more relaxed somehow. Perhaps the shifting dynamics in our family were good for him too. Perhaps peace was healing all of us slowly. My mother greeted us at the door with an apron tied around her waist and flour on her hands. She was making pumpkin pie from scratch, something she used to do when we were young before the holidays became elaborate productions. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the house, unlocking memories I had buried deep. She smiled at us, nervous but genuine. I found myself smiling back. Dinner was quieter than previous years, but the silence felt full rather than empty. We talked about Claire's new apartment and my job, about my father's golf game and my mother's plans to take a watercolor class. Ordinary family conversation without the undercurrents of judgment I had grown accustomed to. At one point, my mother complimented my earrings, simple silver hoops I had bought for myself. I thanked her, surprised by how natural it felt. After dinner, my mother asked if she could speak with me alone. My stomach tightened, but I agreed. We walked into the living room while Claire and Dad handled the dishes. She sat across from me in my father's armchair, looking smaller than the woman who had dominated my childhood. She said she had been seeing a therapist since the summer. She was trying to understand why she had become the mother she was. She told me she didn't expect everything to be fixed by a few conversations or one good holiday. She knew trust had to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than words. She promised to keep trying, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved a mother who showed up differently. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks as I listened. I told her that was all I had ever wanted. And sitting there in my childhood home, I finally believed that healing was possible. Winter settled over my life like a soft blanket, bringing with it a stillness I had never experienced before. The holidays had passed without incident, and January arrived with clean snow and quiet mornings. I found myself waking earlier than necessary, savoring the peaceful hours before work demanded my attention. My apartment felt different now, less like a refuge from my family, and more like a home I had genuinely chosen for myself. Claire and I had developed a Sunday tradition. Every week, one of us would cook dinner for the other, alternating between her tiny apartment and mine. We were making up for lost decades, filling the empty spaces with recipes, laughter, and honest conversations. She was thriving in her new independence, finding pieces of herself that had been dormant throughout her marriage. Watching her bloom reminded me that growth has no age limit. My mother continued sending texts, and gradually I began responding with more than single words. We exchanged photos of meals we had cooked and books we were reading, small threads of connection that required nothing but presence. She never pushed for more than I could give, and I appreciated the patience she was finally learning to practice. We were building something fragile but real, one careful message at a time. In February, I received a letter from my grandmother's estate attorney. It was a follow-up regarding the trust, confirming that all funds had been successfully transferred to my accounts. Attached was a handwritten note my grandmother had left with the original documents. The attorney explained he had found it misfiled and wanted to ensure I received it. My hands trembled as I unfolded the yellowed paper. Her handwriting was exactly as I remembered, elegant loops and careful spacing that reflected her deliberate nature. She wrote that she had watched me struggle against expectations my whole life. She said my independence reminded her of herself as a young woman before she learned to shrink. She wanted the money to give me choices, not obligations. She wanted me to build a life that was truly mine, without asking anyone's permission. I sat with that letter for hours, reading it over and over until the words blurred through my tears. My grandmother had seen me clearly when I couldn't see myself. She had planted seeds of belief that were only now beginning to flower. I thought about calling my mother to share the letter, then decided against it. Some things were meant to be held privately, treasures that belonged only to the people who understood their weight. Spring arrived early that year, coaxing green from the gray landscape weeks ahead of schedule. I had started thinking about what to do with the remaining trust money. The student loans were paid, and I had enough saved for a down payment whenever I was ready. But the idea of buying a house felt less urgent than it once had. I was learning that security came from within, not from property or possessions. Claire suggested we take a trip together, somewhere neither of us had ever been. She had always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean, and I had vacation days accumulating faster than I could use them. We spent evenings researching small coastal towns, dreaming out loud about salt air and long walks on unfamiliar beaches. Planning something joyful together felt like another form of healing, proof that our relationship could hold more than shared trauma. In April, my mother called with news that made my heart skip. She and my father were renewing their vows for their 40th anniversary. She asked if Claire and I would stand beside her during the small ceremony. The request caught me completely off guard. I had expected many things from this new version of my mother, but vulnerability was still surprising. I told her I would be honored, and I meant it. The ceremony was held in my parents' backyard on a sunny Saturday afternoon. My mother wore a simple cream dress, and my father looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Claire and I stood nearby, holding small bouquets of flowers from Mom's garden. The roses she had tended so carefully were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness. I thought about all the seasons it had taken to reach this moment. During the reception, my father gave a speech that made everyone cry. He talked about the challenges of 40 years together, the misunderstandings and mistakes that had tested their commitment. He said the secret to lasting love was choosing each other every single day, especially on the days when choosing felt hard. He looked at my mother with such tenderness that I finally understood what forgiveness could build when given enough time. Later that evening, my mother found me alone by the rose bushes again. She stood beside me in comfortable silence before speaking. She said she had been thinking about the letter from Grandma, the one she had hidden. She admitted she had been afraid that if I had the money, I wouldn't need her anymore. The confession was raw and honest. I realized her control had always been rooted in fear of abandonment. I told her that needing someone and loving someone were different things. I said I had stopped needing her approval years ago, but I was learning to love her again anyway. She nodded slowly, absorbing words that probably hurt even as they healed. We stood together watching the sun set behind the trees, two women who had finally stopped fighting and started understanding. The silence between us felt like acceptance. That summer, Claire and I took our trip to the Oregon coast. We rented a small cabin near the beach and spent a week doing absolutely nothing important. We watched the waves for hours, collected shells and sea glass, and talked about our futures without fear. Claire was considering going back to school for a degree she had abandoned years ago. I encouraged her without reservation. We were both becoming women our younger selves would admire. On our last night, we sat on the beach watching the stars appear one by one. Claire said she was grateful for everything that had happened, even the painful parts. She said losing her marriage and finding her sister had been the hardest and best year of her life. I told her I understood completely. Sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt stronger. We had both been broken and were both rebuilding. I returned home with sand in my suitcase and peace in my heart. My apartment welcomed me back with familiar comfort, but I saw it differently now. It wasn't just a place to live. It was evidence of everything I had created on my own terms. The promotion, the independence, the relationships I had chosen to nurture. My grandmother's trust had given me financial freedom, but I had given myself something more valuable. That fall, I finally used the remaining money for a down payment on a small house with a garden. It wasn't far from Claire's apartment, and it had a guest room for when my parents visited. The first thing I planted was a rose bush, started from a cutting my mother had given me. Watching it take root in my own soil felt like completing a circle I hadn't known I was drawing all along. My father helped me move in on a crisp October weekend. He carried boxes without complaint and fixed a squeaky door I hadn't even mentioned. My mother brought curtains she had sewn herself, simple white fabric that let the light pour through. Claire arrived with wine and pizza, and we sat on my empty living room floor, surrounded by cardboard and possibility. 4 people who had learned to be a family differently. Before they left that evening, my mother hugged me at the door. She whispered that she was proud of the woman I had become, proud of my strength and my willingness to try again. I told her I had learned resilience from watching her tend roses through every season, never giving up even when the blooms refused to come. She laughed softly, and I realized it was the first time I had ever compared myself to her as a compliment. Now, as I write this from my own kitchen table, I understand that the story was never really about the money. It was about a daughter learning she deserved to be seen, a mother learning to let go of fear, and 2 sisters discovering each other after decades of distance. My grandmother knew something I had to learn for myself. Responsibility isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, trying again, and believing you're worth the effort. And I finally do.